So welcome to our next Pause for Thought. And I know that this person is quite familiar, certainly to me. But I'd like to invite Joel to come up, and he's going to share for the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes perhaps, the Psalms and poetry in the Psalms. And then there'll be some space to ask questions, to explore, think about it a bit further, and then we'll end with hot drinks, coffee, and there's also non-caffeinated hot drinks as well. So welcome to all of you here in venue and those of you who will be joining us online. So Joel, come up.
Thank you. So this evening I'm mostly going to be talking about the Psalms as poetry and looking at how the poetry of sort of ancient Hebrew texts might differ from English poetry that we're used to today. I hope it doesn't get too technical. There will be some Hebrew on the screen, but it's sort of as a visual aid. You don't need to be able to read it to understand what I'm saying about it. So before I get into the sort of the differences and the similarities between Hebrew poetry and English poetry, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes asking why it might be useful to have this discussion and what the grounds are for treating biblical texts in this way. What is the reason that we can say the Psalms are poetry? And also what some of the problems with saying the Psalms are poetry are. Why might it be difficult to say that? So the first thing I want to say is that when we open up our Bibles and we look at the texts of the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament, we can be pretty confident that the words we're reading have survived virtually unchanged for at least 2,300 years. We've got manuscript copies from around 300 BC of the Hebrew scriptures, and there are virtually no changes between that text and the text that the scholars now use, the Westminster Codex, which is sort of the standardized Hebrew text for the Old Testament. There's virtually no change between the 300 BC and then. The Jewish custodians of that text have been incredibly diligent and incredibly fastidious when it comes to copying it down and making sure everything is still where it was to start with. However, there are some differences between what the scholars 300 years before Christ would have seen when they picked up the Hebrew text and what we see if we pick up the Westminster Codex today. And I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of what the difference between that is. So I've got some slides showing you the text as it would have appeared on the scrolls in 300 BC. So I'm not sure if these are exactly from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they are texts very similar to them. And you can see we've got two different books of the Bible on there. The first one is Deuteronomy, and the second one is the book that we're going to be looking at mostly this evening, which is Psalms. This slide is the same text from Psalms compared to what is in the modern Westminster Codex in Psalms, the one that our English language Bibles are translated from. So you can see there are significant differences primarily in the layout between what's in the scroll and what's in the Bible. This third psalm, the third slide, is just showing you the difference between the Deuteronomy text that we looked at in the first slide, in the first scroll, and the Psalms text as they now appear in the most recent editions of the Hebrew Bible. So, what comments can we make about those three slides? What are the differences? What's changed? Anybody want to shout out?
Is it numbers on it? The chapters, is it all verses? Have they been added?
Yep, so if you look back at the scroll, there are no verse numbers. There are no chapter numbers. Anything else that's different?
It looks like it's typed, not handwritten.
Yeah, so the modern version is typed rather than handwritten. Yeah, or yeah, probably not typed anymore. It's probably in a computer. Yeah.
But the one on the right, if that's the Psalms,
That's both Psalms.
they're both Psalms.
They're the same
It looks
passage.
more like poetry. I mean,
Yes.
the length of the lines vary a lot.
Yeah. So if we look at that again compared to Deuteronomy, so that's in the modern Bible, Hebrew Bible, you can see that the Deuteronomy text looks more like a piece of prose as we would expect to see it, and the Psalms text looks more like poetry. This is the various things we've talked about. The sort of the obvious thing about the chapter numbers and the verses. These were probably added in about the 7th century AD. So for most of the life of the text, there were no numbers in there. They're much younger than the texts themselves. The Psalms passages, we've said, are arranged in such a way as to resemble poetry as we understand it now. But why would that be the case? Why would somebody have arranged it like that? When we look at the ancient scrolls, we can see that they're not arranged like that to begin with. So what is it that's caused this to become the standard? And is it then a problem to start talking about the Psalms as poetry if our oldest texts don't look like this at all? So that's sort of the problems and the differences between the ancient and the modern versions of the text. And I just want to go on to why it matters that we categorise them at all. I think it matters because it does make a difference if we consider what type of document we're reading. It changes the way that we respond to it. So if we know we're reading a history, we respond to that in a different way than if we think that we're reading a fable. If we think we're reading a fable, we respond to that in a different way to the way we would respond to a set of laws. A set of laws is different to drama, and poetry is different to prose. So we read and we respond in unique ways dependent on what it is that we think we're reading. So I'm now going to go into a little bit why we might consider the Psalms poetry. And then I'm going to start looking at some of the things that are distinctive about ancient Hebrew poetry that make it different from English poetry. But before I get onto that, I just want to make a couple of points to explain why what I'm about to say isn't always true. So these are some caveats. I'm going to list a number of tropes that are common in ancient Hebrew poetry, but of course the best poets, as we know from reading English poetry, don't always follow the rules. Usually they know what the rules are, and they know that their readers know what the rules are, but they play with them. They play with that understanding in their readers' heads to make something that is artistic. It's quite simple to say, okay, write a poem according to these rules, and to do it, or to copy somebody else's poem and change some words. But the best poets are the ones who know the rules, but don't always keep them. So sometimes they'll tease the reader and say, I know what you think I'm going to do, so now I'm going to do something different. And so this means that the tropes that I'm going to go on to talk about are really just generalizations. They're not true in all instances, and you'll be able to open your Bible and find some psalms that do what I say they're going to do, and then you'll find others where you say, oh, I can't see that at all. The second thing is that the book of Psalms was probably compiled using material that spanned at least 200 years. Some of the Psalms are attributed to much earlier sources than that. So, for example, we get Psalms that say this is a Psalm of David. A lot of the Psalms say this is a Psalm of David. Now, we can't verify for certain that David did write them, but if he did, then you can add another 600 years onto that 200-year time span. And so we're looking at psalms that may have been written over sort of an 800-year time span. And if we think about English poetry, a book that was written this year of modern poems is going to be very different to a volume written in the 1200s. It won't look the same. So those are sort of the caveats before we get into some of the rules. That there are rules and we can observe some of the rules, but great poets don't always obey the rules, and also the psalms were composed over a long period of time. So I didn't warn you about this. Probably should have done that while I was telling you there was going to be some Hebrew, but now we're going to write a poem. So let's write some poetry. We're not actually going to write a poem, but what I want to do is just to agree on some ground rules before we start writing. So we're going to start writing a poem in English. Let's pick a topic. Let's say we'll write a poem about our journey here this evening. So before we put any words at all on the page, what are the things that we need to agree on about this poem? Well, what would make it a poem rather than a piece of prose writing about our walk here or cycle here?
Pauses.
Pauses, yep. Metaphors, yeah. Rhyming, perhaps. We'd have to make a decision, wouldn't we? We'd have to decide whether we rhymed it or not.
Is Hebrew an inflected language? Does it matter in what order you write the words?
So word order.
Yes.
It does to an extent, yeah.
Because, for instance, Russian doesn't matter, which is why Pushkin has never been translated successfully, so people say. Because you can write Russian in any order, because the dative, the genitive, the part of speech that means a lot to Russians no matter in what order.
Yeah.
Whereas you can't do that with English.
No, Hebrew is more like Russian,
Yes.
but probably not as far. I haven't read any Russian, but the Hebrew, it does matter, but not as much as it does in English.
Yes.
So we've got rhyme, we've got metaphor, we've got pauses. What else would an English poem have that it would sort of distinguish it from a bit of prose?
It's sort of somehow packed of images and things. I mean, a line, there's a lot in one phrase. I don't know how to express it, but...
Yeah, so sort of economy of language, probably, something like that.
Yeah, that's very...
It would have a metre, wouldn't it? It would be a sort
Yeah,
of
so metre
a
is...
pattern.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, of course not.
Again, it's sort of one of those things that it may or may not, but it's probably something we'd make a decision on before we sat down to write the poem. Is it going to be metered? Is it going to rhyme?
Is it going to have capital letters at the beginning?
Is it going to have capital letters at the beginning? Yeah. They don't,
And a full stop.
they don't have to worry about capital letters in Hebrew because they're all... Yeah. Okay, so these are the ones that I thought we might say. So rhyme, rhythm, meter, and sort of the stanza structure. By that I mean, like, how many lines are we going to put in a verse? Are we going to put verses in at all? How are we going to divide the text up into blocks? So, unless you have an unusual translation of the Bible, you won't find any of the Psalms that rhyme. It's fair to say that that's generally true of the Hebrew as well as the English translations that we've got. If there is a rhyme in Hebrew, it tends to be accidental. The Hebrew language is made up of 3-letter words, root words, on which are sort of attached prefixes and suffixes to make them into longer words and verbs and nouns and all the various bits of language, which means that a lot of the endings tend to be the same. So words in the Hebrew text will rhyme, but it's not necessarily a deliberate rhyme, it's just that's how the language is structured. So on the whole, you won't find in the Hebrew sort of a deliberate rhyme at the end of a line. We've already looked at the scroll and seen that there isn't really an end of the line either. But we won't find a regular rhyming word within the psalm. Rhythm and meter are also very difficult to discern in the Psalms. There have been a number of attempts to do this, to sort of identify a rhythmic system, counting syllables, counting stressed syllables, so on. But none of them are very convincing, and almost all of them you can immediately find examples of Psalms where it doesn't follow that pattern. You will have noticed when you looked at the modern Hebrew text, hopefully if it was big enough, that there are vowels and stress notations as well as the letters in the modern Hebrew text. So Neil noticed that there were numbers in the modern one, but there are also the little marks that appear under each of the letters, and those are vowels. And there are also some little marks that appear above the letters, which tell you which part of the sentence to stress. But those were all added a lot later than the original text. They were added about 600 or 700 years after anybody had stopped speaking the ancient Hebrew language. So all of our attempts to speak Hebrew, and this includes if you go to the synagogue and you listen to them singing, they're sort of guesses as to how this language was spoken, and guesses that have got the vowels and things added 600 or 700 years after it stopped being spoken. So most lines, I would say, as we've broken them up in our text, have maybe 3 or 4 stresses, but they're added later. So verses or stanzas. The Bible that you have, the sort of the English language copy of the Bible, probably breaks up the Psalms in some way. And when we start getting into what the texts actually say, there are definite points at which there seems to be a break and something else starts happening. But they're pretty irregular. It's hard to find a pattern that says this is definitely verse, distinct and different from the other prose parts of the Bible. So, what does that all tell us? Ancient Hebrew and modern English are very different languages with very different traditions. What we understand as poetry today, if we were to go to Blackwell's and pick up a book of poetry, it would be very hard to find something that looks exactly like that in the Bible. But the Psalms do appear to be doing something different textually than books like Deuteronomy, which is narrative and law, or Samuel, which is largely narrative, or Kings, which is history, or Ezra, which is sort of legal pronouncements, legal documents. So it does appear to be doing something quite different. And we're going to have a look at an example of some of those differences. It's also worth mentioning, and this sort of is a big pointer in the text itself to the fact that these are meant to be poems, is that a lot of the Psalms are introduced with a sentence saying, this is a song of David, this is a song of ascents. And those words that are used to designate them as songs or psalms are a pretty big clue as to what the texts are supposed to be. The problem with those words is that they are words that are difficult to translate because they're only really used in this context. So we sort of know that there's something different about the Psalms from those words, and we guess that it means that they're sort of songs of some kind. What I want to talk about now, though, is the style of the Psalms. One of the things that quite a lot of the Psalms does, which is really helpful in offering us some direct comparisons between prose and poetry in the Bible, is that they repeat the stories that we know from elsewhere in the text. And probably most frequently they repeat the Exodus story. And so when we read these comparatively, we find something that readers of English poetry can recognise, and that's the one that Neil mentioned, which is economy of language, or brevity. So here we go. This is an example from Psalm 105 of an Exodus text. Unfortunately, I can't actually read it up there. So what we're looking at here is the plagues. So this is the plagues in the Psalms. In Psalm 105, we get, from verses 26 to 36, we get an account of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Let's see if I can find it in here quickly. He sent his servant Moses and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They performed his signs among them and miracles in the lands of Ham. He sent darkness and made the land dark. They rebelled against his words. He turned their waters into blood and caused their fish to die. Their land swarmed with frogs, and so on. It lasts for 10 verses, whereas in Exodus, it lasts for 4 chapters. So immediately we start to see that the Psalms are doing something quite different with a very familiar story, and they're telling the familiar story in a much shorter way. We can see something similar here in Psalm 77. So this is the crossing of the Red Sea in Psalm 77. And they managed to cover the crossing of the Red Sea in 5 verses here. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled. The clouds poured out water, the skies thundered, your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind, your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So 5 verses. In Exodus, that story takes up a whole chapter, sort of 31 verses. And then we get another couple of songs about it as well. So you can see again, this economy of language, this way of telling a long story in the sort of smallest number of words possible. And that's a feature of English poetry. It's also a feature of ancient Hebrew poetry. There's also something else that you might notice if you know what you're looking for in this section from Psalm 77. It's something that a scholar of the Psalms called Robert Louth discovered in 1753. So this is a sort of a long way into biblical scholarship before anybody pointed out what Louth pointed out. And when you see what it is he pointed out, it becomes obvious that it's there. But he presented a series of lectures which were then turned into a book. And he discovered a phenomenon which he called parallelism, and which has been sort of the dominant study of biblical poetry ever since he discovered it. So Louth said that the basic building block of ancient Hebrew poetry was the parallel line. He noticed that the material in the first line of a Hebrew poem was then repeated in one form or another in the second line. Sometimes this parallelism might flow over into a third line as well. So sometimes you get 3 lines that are sort of parallel to one another. Another Psalms scholar, Robert Alter, calls these parallel lines versets. He wrote a book called The Art of Biblical Poetry, which is very good, very helpful. And he calls them versets to avoid confusion with terms that are already well known in Greek or Latin or English language poetry. So, 2 distinctive features of Hebrew poetry. There's a parallel line structure, and there's also the brevity of the language, the brief verse style. These are probably the most important and the easiest to recognise, so we're going to start with them. Now, the rest of this evening, I'm going to look at Psalm 29, which was just a psalm that I chose to sort of give examples of all of the features that I wanted to show you. And we're going to look at Psalm 29 to see how parallelism works within a whole psalm rather than picking out a single verse. And by looking at the whole psalm or whole poem, we will also see some other features of Hebrew poetry. So here is Psalm 29. Can you see that? This version that's on the screen will be slightly different to the version in your Bible because this is sort of my translation of it. Unfortunately, I can't read it on there, so I'm going to go to the one in the NRSV. So I think I'll read this just so we've got it in our heads before we start breaking it down into its parts. Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Worship the Lord in holy splendor. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The glory of God thunders. The Lord over mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord causes the oaks to whirl and strips the forests bare. And in his temple all say glory. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. So that's Psalm 29, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail. So we've said that Robert Louth identified the parallel line, but he also identified that there were different types of parallel line that appear in the Hebrew verse. So I'm going to look at some of the categories of parallel lines which he identified and point out where we can see those in Psalm 29. So the first category of parallel line that he noticed was the synonymous parallel line. And this is where the first half of the line is echoed in the second half of the line by near synonyms. So we get in Psalm 29, the voice of the Lord breaks cedars. The voice of, and the Lord will smash the cedars of Lebanon. So it's pretty much exactly the same in the second line as it is in the first line. We have breaks turns into smash, and cedars turns into cedars of Lebanon. One of the things that Robert Alter has identified in these parallel lines is that he thinks that there's always an intensification across them as well. So breaks is not as strong a word as smash, and cedars is a less intensified word than cedars of Lebanon, because you've got the sort of the added information about where the cedars are in there. So he thinks there's always an intensification. He's probably usually right, although sometimes you come across verses and you think, yeah, you're massaging that to make it sound like there's intensification. Why is this word more intense in your understanding than that one? But it's generally true. There is also antithetical parallelism, which is when the second half of the line opposes the first half of the line by the use of antonyms. So in Psalm 29, we get verse 9, the voice of the Lord brings forth roe deer and strips bare the forest. Now that's quite different, I think, in the NRSV translation. Causes the oaks to whirl and strips the forest bare. We'll go with my translation, because I can't remember why I translated it like that. But you can see that brings forth and strips bare are sort of opposing one another. Roe deer and forests, they're not quite opposites, but they're not the same term repeated again. But you can see there's still parallels between the two sets of verbs and the two sets of nouns that carry across the line. And then there's synthetic parallelism, which is that the second half of the line may not contain exact parallel terms to the first half of the line, but it sort of follows in the same direction. And I couldn't find any of those in Psalm 29, so this is from Psalm 105, I think, which is the one that we looked at earlier. Yeah, I can't read that on there.
He sent darkness,
He sent
and
darkness.
laid the land dark. They rebel against his words.
So you can see that there are sort of two halves of the line, and the second half of the line is following in the same direction as the first half, although there's no direct parallelism in there. So the verset of parallel lines, which I think we can see in quite a lot of psalms. If you just open up your Bible and pick a psalm at random, you'll usually find examples of this in there. Gives us some sense of the structure of the psalm. So we might be able to use that to break up a long piece like those ancient scrolls that we looked at into the smaller chunks, which look a little bit more like the copy of the modern Hebrew Bible that we looked at. And what's interesting is that once you start doing that, if you start breaking it up into these parallel versets, then you start to notice other structures in there as well. And one of the most common ones that I want to talk about with... I've skipped on a slide. With Psalm... One of the most common ones, and one that we notice in Psalm 29, is called the chiastic structure. Now, this is a structure which isn't unique to Hebrew poetry, and you can find it in the prose works as well. But because poems tend to be shorter, it is easier to identify in them, and it can help us sometimes to get a grasp of what it is that the psalmist thinks is the most important part of the poem that they've written. The chiastic structure is named after the Greek letter chi, which is roughly the same shape as an English X. So the structure is basically a symmetrical structure which mirrors the opening verses with the closing verses, and sort of so on. The second verses with the penultimate verses, and you kind of end up with a shape like that if you draw it out correctly. So here's an example using the verses from Psalm 29. So verses 1 to 3, ascribe to the Lord. It's a sort of an imperative to human beings to confess the qualities of the Lord. And then that's mirrored in verses 10 and 11 when we get the Lord sits enthroned, the Lord sits enthroned as King forever. That's sort of then mirroring the human ascribing of the qualities of God with the actual qualities of God. So you can see that there's sort of a mirroring there. Then verses 3 to 5 are the voice of the Lord. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Verses 7 to 9 do the same thing. So we get the voice of the Lord, the voice of the Lord. The voice of the Lord causes the oaks to whirl. And that means that our middle verse that doesn't fit with either verses 1 to 3 or verses 3 to 5 is verse 6, which is he will make Lebanon dance. I've given you the Hebrew text as well, so hopefully you can see what that looks like. Once we've started to break down the Hebrew text using our system of parallel lines, you can see that the chiastic structure becomes visible. I've highlighted the phrases that in verses 1 to 3 that kind of parallel those with the phrases in verses 10 and 11. So the blue bits match one another, and then the red bits match one another as well, leaving us with this verse in the middle verse 6, which I've highlighted in green. You can see that by looking at the Hebrew text. It sort of seems quite clear. It's pointing our eye towards that verse. Now this seems odd, because probably when I read the psalm to you in the first place, that wasn't the verse that stood out. But we do know that in a lot of Hebrew texts, they are very keen on showing us the middle value. And that's sort of important to them. So when we notice this chiastic structure, we ought to pay some attention to the middle verse, to the verse that it's pointing us to. So let's take a step back now, having looked at the detail of the psalm, and ask what the psalm is all about from a sort of a wider perspective. What do you think this is a poem about? What is it? What's the subject of this poem? What's going on?
God and his power and over everything.
Do you think that the poet may have been sitting somewhere watching something happening and decided to write something about it? What it seems to be about, from sort of a stepping back and stepping out of the detail, it seems to be about a storm. And the poet is using the poetic devices to point us to the person behind that storm, which is God, and the voice of God, which is behind all of the different elements of the storm. So what happens then if we pay attention to the verse which the chiastic structure is pointing us to, bearing in mind that the whole thing is about a storm? So here we have it. He will make Lebanon dance like a calf, and Syrian like the son of wild bulls. I read this psalm this morning at Elsfield in the Book of Common Prayer, and the wild bulls are a unicorn in the Book of Common Prayer translation, which I quite liked and wished I'd put that in here. But so the image in this verse, bearing in mind we're talking about a storm, is quite an easy image to grasp. The wind, which is associated with the voice of God, is making it seem as though the countryside is dancing. The trees, the grasses, the surface of the water, all of it is moving in the wind, in the storm, and the poet is attributing that to the voice of God. It's a nice, well-constructed image. It's maybe even better with unicorns in it. But why would the poet want to draw our attention to that image at the centre of his poem rather than any of the other images that he's produced? Maybe we need to look more closely at the places that are in there, at Lebanon and Syrian. We'll start with Syrian. Syrian appears only twice in the Hebrew scriptures. It's because it's not a Hebrew word. It's a Phoenician word, and it means the Mount Hermon in the north of Israel. Now, Mount Hermon marks the northern border of Israel, and it's also the highest peak in the country. Psalm 133, which I'll look at a little bit later as well, talks about people living together in unity in the dew of Mount Hermon. So it's a place that has sort of idyllic connotations. It's sort of a paradise on earth. If we look at the verse again, we'll notice that it's an example of the parallelism that we were talking about, and that Syrian is paralleled with Lebanon. The question is, are we looking at Louth's synonymous parallelism here, or are we looking at his antithetical parallelism? In other words, is the poet comparing these two places because they're twins, or because they're opposites. So maybe we need to look at the other parallel term. So the other parallel term in there, we've got like a calf and like the son of wild bulls. It's an interesting parallel, that one, because they seem to be the same type. They're both cows, but they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. So we're probably looking for reasons to link Lebanon to Syrian, but also to find it significantly different. So Lebanon, like Mount Hermon, was considered to be an idyllic place. It's an incredibly fertile country. That's why we're constantly hearing in the Bible about the cedars of Lebanon. And we've got that in this psalm, the great cedars that we saw God's voice smashing. However, it's not in Israel. Mount Hermon is in Israel. And so we could see it as an opposition in that respect. So we've got two places, both of which represent paradise on earth, places that are almost outside of history in that sort of idyllic aspect. One of them is inside the borders of the land, and one of them is outside, the national and the international spheres. I think that what this verse does, if we centralize it like the psalmist seems to be doing, is that it changes the scope of the poem from just a local one, which is the storm. We've got someone sitting, watching the rain come down and saying it's God making, and it's making it a universal scope. It's saying, this isn't just about one wild tempest that I happen to experience. It's about God's relation to all of history and all lands, even foreign lands. So that shows how the structure of the poem might direct our attention to a particular verse and then alter our reading of the whole as we sort of expand back out and say, well, what does that mean about the whole verse? That's one way that the reading the chiastic structure can help us to read the psalm. Also, on some occasions, you'll find that there's a chiastic structure within a verse where the words will match each other across the verse and you'll be drawn to one word at the centre of the verse. It's quite hard to do that with English translations rather than with the Hebrew, again because of what Jan was mentioning about word order. Sometimes the Hebrew word order shows you which is the middle term, and then when you translate it into English, it's completely gone. I also couldn't find any examples of it in Psalm 29, so I've not put any in tonight. So we'll move on to another feature, which you might have noticed when I showed you the slide of the whole poem in Hebrew. And the extensive use of it in Psalm 29 is probably one of the reasons why none of the individual verses have very obvious chiastic structures that I can show you as examples of an internal device. So here's the Hebrew version of the psalm again. Hopefully you can see that the first three verses all begin with the same expression. Havu l'Adonai, which means ascribe to the Lord. And that's the idea that we give to God, sort of verbally, human beings give to God God's qualities. And so that same expression is repeated 3 times. And then the fourth line has a similar sentiment, which is Hishtich Evu l'Adonai, which means bow down to the Lord. Then after we've got those 4 lines, we have Kol Adonai 4 times, which is the voice of the Lord. And then we have the central verse, which we've just looked at. We have then 3 more repetitions of Kol Adonai. This feature is called anaphora, and it's when successive lines in a poem begin with the same word or phrase. Again, this isn't a feature that's unique to Hebrew poetry, and there are English poems that you'll find that do this as well. But it gives emphasis to certain lines of the poem, and it also helps us to divide it into sections. So if we were wanting to put breaks between the verses in this and and break it into stanzas, you can see there are obvious places where you would do that with Psalm 29. So we have the ascribe lines, which details what humans should give to God. Then we have the voice lines, which make the link between the speech of God and the activity of life on earth. And finally, we have the Adonai lines at the end, which make statements about who God is. And it's a sort of a slow shifting of focus from what humans do to what God does to who God is. And that's our stanza structure. We have the first stanza, human action, the second stanza, God's action, the third stanza after the middle line, God's action again, and finally, who God is at the end. I want to show you another feature of Hebrew poetry which is quite difficult to read in the English translation, and that is punning. This is, again, as with the chiastic structure, it's a feature of Hebrew writing rather than just Hebrew poetry. But it's a way of you drawing connections between parts of the verse that you might otherwise miss. So, punning is quite an easy thing to do in ancient Hebrew because of the way that all the words are built up on the three consonant roots. It means that there are sort of inherently more connections in the language than we find in English. And also, it doesn't seem to be bad form in Hebrew to repeat the same word over and over again. Whereas in English we say, oh, find another word. In Hebrew they're quite happy to use the same word multiple times, and that's artistic. But in Psalm 29 we find an example of it which draws our attention to the dominant theme which is running all the way through the poem. And that theme is the theme of speech. So we've got 7 times in the poem we have the voice of the Lord. We've got 3 times ascribed to the Lord. We've got the people saying honour, and we've got God blessing his people. All speech throughout the poem. We also have this word here for wilderness in Hebrew, which is built up from the Hebrew word to speak. You can see that so Hebrew is read from right to left. So the last 3 letters of wilderness are the same letters that you find in the verb to speak. So literally the word wilderness means something like in language or in words. And so if we notice this, which we will have done because we're sort of drawn to the fact that there's a pun going on there with the idea of speaking and the voice of God, then we start to read verse 8, which is here, in a different way. And you can kind of see that there are mirrored terms in it. So kol is the voice of the Lord, makes the wilderness shake. But the word order is the other way around. Makes to shake the wilderness. So what started out looking like a poem about a storm transforms by the use of a single punning word into a sort of a philosophical treatise on the relation between the word of God and language itself. God speaks and language shakes. So if we add this discovery about language into our reflection on the chiastic structure, we can see that the poem tackles the question of God's relationships to all of the spaces that we can imagine linguistically. So this includes the paradisal spaces of a sort of idealized and hypothetical Lebanon and Syrian, and all of this is within the extended metaphor of the voice of God causing the storm. So I'm going to draw to a close now. There are some other features that that you find in Hebrew poetry, but they're also common in English poetry. So I'm just going to bring them up on screen and let you have a look at them. But these features all occur in Hebrew poetry as well as the ones that we've looked at. We've got irony, we've got simile and metaphor, which we spoke about at the beginning or mentioned at the beginning. And then we've got alliteration and assonance, which again are very difficult to read in the English translation because we can't see the original language. But those are all there and are all part of what makes Hebrew poetry and sort of distinguishes it from Hebrew prose, which we find in most of the Hebrew Bible. So I hope that gives you a sort of a short overview of some of the features of ancient Hebrew poetry, and that using Psalm 29 as an example, we've seen how recognising them might change the way that we read an individual psalm. There are 150 psalms in this book, so there's lots of scope for further study and for further analysis. But I'm going to stop now and ask whether you have any questions.
I think there's one of my questions about this chi structure, and I've always wondered, because I always think about that centre, and is it really significant? Because when I just closed the book, but it did feel, when I read this psalm, I was trying to think, well, how does it work that is so significant, or is it, in what ways is it significant? Because actually when it comes to a close, you could say actually as it's written, the last two lines, it's sort of like that's sort of the impact at the end. That's where you finish, if you like. And I just wondered whether we have any understanding of that. How significant, is it like the main point and we should go to it because that's, so we really get an impact, or did it sort of somehow operate in a different way? Obviously it did have an effect, but it wasn't like the final statement. It was sort of, I don't know whether we.
I think it's hard to know exactly how the original readers of the text would have interpreted it, or even how the original writers of the text saw what it was that they were doing. I think, though, it occurs enough times, it's frequent enough to say this is a feature, and we also know that people who read modern Hebrew, or sort of modern Hebrew readers reading biblical texts, are drawn to those central values. And so I think it's something that we need to be conscious of when we're reading the text. Now, whether we say that's the message in the middle verse, or whether we do something more similar to what I was trying to do this evening, which is you go into that verse and say, well, what do I take out of that verse to read back into the rest of it that I wouldn't initially have seen or concentrated on?
A couple of questions about form, really. In English translations of the Psalms, we sometimes have a refrain. Is that there in Hebrew?
In some of the Psalms it is, yeah.
And the other one was, is the stress related? I mean, like in Old English poetry, stress is related to alliteration. Is stress in Hebrew poetry related to anything?
I don't know enough about the stress. Well, you would. The best way to find out about stress is to go to the synagogue and ask them how they read it. I went along to the synagogue and joined in with some of their chanting of psalms. It's just so fast. You sort of, I mean, my Hebrew reading is I can translate a word with a dictionary in about 5 minutes, but they're charging through it, and I can just about see where they are on the page. But so I'm not sure exactly how they've done it, but I think there is sort of a tonal element to it, but beyond that, I'm not sure.
So, going on from that, Joel, with the chanting, I mean, what about the music? And it seems that they were perhaps set to music in the first place. I mean, they're really songs rather than poems, perhaps. And how important would the music be? And not very often when we sing something, maybe that changes the stresses and the way that you understand the words, perhaps.
Yeah, I think
That's
yeah,
sort of completely
yeah,
unknown. I guess we have no
yeah.
idea.
We don't know how they originally read them, I think is the answer to that. We can guess, and some of the words that introduce the Psalms do sound like they're saying these are songs, so we can guess that they did sing them. But then again, if you go to the synagogue and you listen to them reading scripture, it's musical, but it's sort of chanting. I suppose it's a bit like the way that we do Anglican chant when we read the Psalms. It's a bit like that, but that's modern. So how that compares to how the ancient Israelites read them, I don't know.
And we don't have anything to know how they would have been used in, say, in early times, in the times of Jesus, or in the times of in Jewish worship in the synagogue in early years.
I'm sure that there is some information on that. I don't know it.
One of the things that struck me as you were looking at it is this sort of, how they compress the stories, and how that, were they very keen, very in mind to evoke worship, so that people reading it were suddenly, really encouraged. I'm putting all this stuff together that we know we could take a long time reading, but actually this is like pum pum pum, and to create that emotional impact, so that actually, yes, this is our God. Yes, wonderful things he's done, and we'll look at his power, particularly that one.
It's much more dynamic, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
when you read it, if you can read the story of crossing the Red Sea in 5 verses, and you already know what the story is, so you can fill in the bits that it misses out.
From studying the Psalms and your learning the Hebrew, how do you think it's affected your own faith? Spiritually, how do you think it's, or has it?
I think what it does is, and I know a lot of people use the Psalms for this anyway. The Psalms are used as devotional material anyway. But I think what it does for me is it takes me back to the original author of the text, and it puts a very sort of human spin on where they came from. So the idea that somebody's sitting there watching a storm while they're writing this psalm, to me that puts me in a place where I can identify more with the psalmist than if I'm just reading the text and without thinking about that. So I think that's probably what it does. And I think that's what looking at art does for me generally, that it sort of puts you in the place of the artist, and it helps you to experience things as the artist experiences them. Yes, David.
I've always understood that the Beatitudes in the New Testament read more like Psalms. Has anybody ever studied that? Is that just an observation?
I think the problem with trying to draw those comparisons is that they're written in different languages. So it's possible that Jesus is doing it in the style of a psalm, but I think it would be hard from the biblical text that we have to do that very easily. I know some of the intertestamental literature, sort of Baruch and those books, which are also poems but were written in Greek rather than in Hebrew, are quite different types of poetry to the Psalms, and you don't get things like the parallelism and things that we see in the Hebrew Psalms are not there in the Greek language Psalms, and so it's quite possible Jesus did that. One of the things I think is interesting about the reported speech in the Hebrew scriptures is that reported speech is quite often written in verse. So sometimes when Moses says something, it's written as verse. And so again, it's possible that stylistically authors would want to put spoken word in verse forms. So it might be that the writers of the Gospels have taken what Jesus said in the Beatitudes and have turned it into a verse. It's possible.
You can stay there. So, well, a huge thank you. I think we've learnt a lot this evening. If you want to hear more of Joel, come to his next lecture on the July the 9th, which is a Saturday. It's at 10 o'clock, so a slightly different time for those who maybe find evenings difficult. And we may even do some kind of something breakfasty afterwards. So that's 10 o'clock, Jonah. And it's called Jonah the Big Fish, Race, Relations and Comedy. But our next Pause for Thought is actually on the 12th. It's the same slot, so it's a Sunday evening on the 12th of June. And we've got Canon Richard Pears coming, and he's looking at praying with icons. So a huge thank you to you, Joel. Do stay. Feel free to quiz him further as we have a drink. If you want to stay for that, you're very welcome to.